Welcome back. I'm David Gura. HUD Secretary Ben Carson has an ethics problem, and while we've been distracted by the Nunes memo, the Carson family and HUD have been able to keep this issue from turning into a political firestorm that, under more normal circumstances, might have caused a bigger stir. Reporting from the Washington Post uncovered Secretary Carson allowed his son, Ben Carson Jr., to organize an agency listening tour in Baltimore last summer, despite warnings from the department's lawyers that Carson's son and daughter-in-law were inviting people they'd potentially done business with. That would be a violation of federal ethics rules. Well, now Secretary Carson is calling for an independent review, tweeting Friday evening that he has been under attack by the media. Joining me now are two former staffers who worked closely with Secretary Carson. That's former Deputy Chief of Staff at HUD, Michael Singleton, and a senior strategist for Ben Carson's 2016 presidential campaign, Jason Osborne. I want to get each of you just to react to this reporting in the Washington Post. Michael, I'll start with you. Okay. What do you make of what's been reported in the Post?
I mean, look, David, if the two authors of that particular article would have done further research, they would have discovered that the SBA, Small Business Association, vetted Meridian long before Dr. Carson ever was sworn in. And so they were already in the process to receive that $485,000. Now, if you do further research, you would discover that any amount under $4 million for in institutions or organizations that have that minority status actually don't have to compete, but they did go through a competitive process and ultimately were selected. So there's a little misinformation there in that particular column that's easily discoverable.
Just want to read a little bit from that. You referenced that $485,000 contract. Let me read from the Post. CMS, the Center for Medicaid Services, they're awarding a $485,000 contract to the consulting company Meridian, whose chief executive is Marilyn Carson. Carson Jr. identifies himself as one of Meridian's board members. The contract was awarded without a competitive bidding process, federal records show, although a CMS spokesman said multiple minority-owned firms were considered. Jason Osborne, what does all of this say to you, or what should it say to us about the relationship that the Secretary of HUD has to his family?
Well, first off, I think there's two separate issues that we're talking about in this article. The one that Michael just mentioned, that CMS is a completely different agency that Dr. Carson has no control over, no oversight over, and no influence, other than the fact that he happens to know the people over at HHS.
So let's pull it back to HUD and to this tour of Baltimore.
Exactly. So I think you have to look at what Dr. Carson set out to do when he took over as Housing and Urban Development Secretary. He wanted to actually embark on a listening tour, which it was a very successful tour, in the hopes of trying to understand public housing and the mission of HUD overall. And I think to reach out to your family, who is, like Dr. Carson, predominantly living in Maryland, is only natural. And I think we have to be clear that this article did not say that he violated anything ethically. It may optically look bad, but I think at the end of the day, knowing Dr. Carson, and I commend him for asking for an independent review of this, but knowing Dr. Carson, his faith and his family are the two most important things in his life. And so reaching out and wanting to include more and more stakeholders in the discussion of what the mission of HUD should be was important. And I think you see the fruits of that by the announcement in December of Envision Centers, which bring stakeholders not only from government, but faith-based groups, from nonprofit groups, business leaders, all around the country, trying to help people get out of public housing and become more self-sufficient, which is what we all want.
Go ahead, Michael, I just want to ask you about that. I met with Dr. Carson when he was up in New York maybe 4 or 5 months ago, and that listening tour was continuing. And I just want to get a sense from you of what Dr. Carson's vision for the department is. I was struck in talking to him that he was still very much out there trying to figure out what he wanted to do with the department. But here we are, now over a year into this administration. Do you have the sense here that he now has a clear sense, a clear vision for what he wants to do with that department?
No, absolutely. When I was there at HUD initially, the listening tour was actually my responsibility, so I'm extremely familiar with it. As Jason alluded, the objective of the listening tour was to give Dr. Carson an opportunity to not only talk to HUD employees out in the field, not only to talk to stakeholders, but to talk to the recipients, the individuals who rely on HUD for their everyday. At the end of that course, Dr. Carson decided, as Jason also mentioned, to launch the Envision Centers, which was publicly announced in December December. And so now senior staffers are currently in the process. I've spoken with several today before appearing on your show. They're in the process now of setting up those Envision centers. It's a community collaborative effort to benefit individuals who do rely on the services that HUD provides.
Jason, I want to go back to the point that you made that he was on this listening tour wanting to learn more about various parts of America. I mean, he knows Baltimore well. This is a guy that we associate so much with Baltimore, with his work as a neurosurgeon at the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. I mean, there's something here that does raise an eyebrow. That's a city that he already knows well.
Yeah, but Dr. Carson's job isn't to organize a tour and isn't to personally go out and invite people. And I think you also have to remember that every secretary that came in this administration was dealing with, folks within those agencies that didn't necessarily appreciate what the secretary's contributions would be. Dr. Carson, again, going back to his faith and his family, reached out to people that he relies on and trusts immensely and wanted to include, again, knowing that his son is very actively involved in the business community in Baltimore. Yes, bring in as many people as you can. And I think it is, again, worth stating that this is an optics issue. This is not an ethical issue. The language that we're seeing in these articles are, this could be an ethical issue. It only becomes an ethical issue if there's business involved and people actually getting money from HUD, and I don't see any of that in here right now.
Well, and
David, I look
David,
forward to the review.
Yeah, sure, Michael, very quickly.
And David, if I could say really quickly, if I recall correctly, I believe the tour was an 8-city tour. Ben Carson Jr., or BJ as I refer to him, was only involved in the Baltimore tour, and again, it was only to reach out to individuals who could assist Dr. Carson with being as effective as possible. So again, this column that has a lot of these innuendos, possiblies, maybes, it's just not accurate. It doesn't hold water, and I think these reporters are looking and fishing for something that just honestly isn't there.
We'll see what happens. Sure, Michael Singleton, thank you very much. Jason Osborne, thanks to
David.
you as well. Some particular insight there on this Saturday afternoon. And still ahead.